This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1962, Cornelius Whitmore, a surveyor for the Arkansas Department of Highways, was conducting routine boundary assessments in the remote depths of the Ozark Mountains when he stumbled upon what would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the region's documented history. The discovery occurred approximately 14 miles northwest of Yellville, Arkansas, in a section of dense woodland that had remained largely untouched since the early settlement days. Whitmore, a methodical man in his 40s who had spent the better part of 2 decades mapping the most isolated corners of Arkansas, later described the cabin as appearing to emerge from the forest itself. Weather-beaten cedar logs, darkened by decades of moisture and neglect, formed walls that seemed to lean inward as if the structure were slowly collapsing under the weight of accumulated secrets. The roof, once covered with hand-split shingles, had partially caved in on the eastern side, allowing years of rain and fallen leaves to create a thick, moldering carpet across what had once been the main living space. What initially drew Whitmore's attention was not the cabin itself, but rather the deliberate way it had been concealed. Unlike typical homesteader cabins of the region, which were usually positioned to take advantage of natural clearings or water sources, this structure had been built in a natural depression surrounded by a dense grove of white oak and hickory trees that effectively screened it from view until one was nearly upon it. The surveyor noted in his official report that the location suggested someone had specifically chosen concealment over convenience. Upon closer inspection, Whitmore found that the cabin's single door had been secured not with a simple latch, but with multiple heavy iron bolts that had been installed from the outside. This unusual arrangement meant that whatever was being kept inside could not be opened from within. The windows, small and positioned high on the walls, had been boarded over with thick planks that showed no signs of weathering, suggesting they had been sealed deliberately and recently enough to still show the marks of fresh sawdust. It was while attempting to document the structure for his survey report that Whitmore noticed something peculiar about the cabin's construction. The interior walls, visible through gaps in the collapsed roof, appeared to be lined with what looked like hundreds of pieces of paper. At first, he assumed these might be newspapers or catalogs used as insulation, a common practice among rural builders of limited means. However, the uniformity of the paper and the deliberate way it had been arranged suggested something far more intentional. Using a crowbar from his surveying kit, Whitmore managed to force open one of the exterior bolts and gain entry to the cabin. The smell that greeted him was not the expected mustiness of an abandoned structure, but something far more unsettling, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to combine the scent of old flowers with an underlying note of decay. The source of this smell would not become apparent until much later in his investigation. The papers lining the walls were, as he had initially suspected, arranged with deliberate precision. However, they were not newspapers or printed materials. Instead, they consisted entirely of handwritten correspondence, hundreds of letters, notes, and fragments of what appeared to be personal communications. Each piece had been carefully attached to the wooden walls with small iron tacks, creating an elaborate collage that covered every available surface from floor to ceiling. Whitmore's initial examination revealed that the correspondence appeared to span a significant period of time, with dates ranging from the early 1920s through the late 1940s. The handwriting varied dramatically between pieces, some written in a precise, educated script, others in the rough, uneven letters of someone with limited formal schooling. Most disturbing of all, many of the letters appeared to be unfinished, ending mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted or had simply lost the ability to continue. The surveyor spent nearly 3 hours in the cabin that first day, photographing and cataloging what he found. His official report, filed with the Arkansas Department of Highways on November 15, 1962, noted the existence of the structure, but made no mention of its contents. However, Whitmore's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1967, reveals that he had immediately recognized the significance of his discovery and had made the decision to conduct his own unofficial investigation. According to his journal entries, Whitmore returned to the cabin on 4 separate occasions over the following month, each time spending hours transcribing the contents of the letters he found there. The picture that emerged from this correspondence was that of a family that had lived in complete isolation in the Ozark wilderness, communicating with the outside world only through a complex network of written messages that appeared to serve purposes far beyond simple correspondence. The Ashford family, as Whitmore was able to determine from the signatures and references within the letters, had apparently settled in the remote Ozark region sometime in the early 1920s. The family consisted of Ezekiel Ashford, described in various letters as a man of considerable education despite his choice to live in virtual isolation, his wife Minerva, and their adult offspring, whose exact number and names varied confusingly between different pieces of correspondence. What made the Ashford correspondence particularly disturbing was not simply its volume, but the gradual evolution of its tone and content over the decades represented. The earliest letters, dating from 1923, appeared to be routine communications between family members, requests for supplies from town, discussions of weather and crops, expressions of affection between family members separated by distance or circumstance. However, as the dates progressed through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the content of the letters began to shift in ways that Whitmore found increasingly unsettling. References to the work began to appear with increasing frequency, always capitalized and always discussed in terms that suggested both importance and secrecy. Family members wrote to each other about maintaining the silence and protecting the process, using language that seemed to carry implications far beyond their surface meaning. One letter, dated July 15, 1931, written in what appeared to be Ezekiel Ashford's careful script, contained a passage that Whitmore transcribed multiple times, apparently struggling to believe what he was reading. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as M, and contained detailed instructions for preparing the subjects for what was referred to as the necessary procedure. The instructions included specifics about dietary restrictions, isolation requirements, and methods for ensuring complete cooperation that read more like a medical protocol than family correspondence. Perhaps even more disturbing were the responses to such letters, written in different handwriting and apparently from different family members, expressing not shock or concern, but rather calm acceptance and requests for clarification on technical details. These responses suggested a level of coordination and planning that indicated the family's activities, whatever they were, had been ongoing for years and involved multiple participants. The correspondence from the mid-1930s introduced references to subjects and candidates that were clearly distinct from family members. Letters discussed the acquisition of these individuals with the same casual tone that might be used to discuss the purchase of livestock or farming equipment. One particularly chilling letter, dated September 3, 1936, contained a detailed inventory of current subjects with notes about their suitability for various applications and projected duration of usefulness. Whitmore's journal reveals that he initially dismissed these letters as possibly referring to some form of agricultural or business venture. The Ozark region had a long history of isolated communities engaging in activities that might require secrecy. Illegal distillation operations, for instance, or small-scale mining ventures that might wish to avoid taxation or regulation. However, as he continued reading through the correspondence, this explanation became increasingly inadequate. The letters from the late 1930s and early 1940s contained increasingly detailed discussions of what could only be described as systematic human experimentation. Family members wrote to each other about tolerance levels and response variations, with the clinical detachment of scientists reporting laboratory results. They discussed modifications to their procedures based on subject feedback and debated the merits of different approaches to achieving what they consistently referred to as optimal outcomes. What made these communications even more disturbing was their tone of casual routine. The family members wrote about these activities with the same matter-of-fact attitude they might use to discuss crop rotation or weather patterns. There was no indication of moral conflict or emotional distress, suggesting that whatever they were doing had become simply another aspect of their daily lives. The correspondence also revealed that the family's activities were not random or impulsive, but rather part of what appeared to be a systematic, long-term project. References throughout the letters suggested they were working toward some specific goal, something they referred to as the completion or the final demonstration. The exact nature of this goal remained unclear from the correspondence, but the dedication with which the family pursued it was evident in every letter. Whitmore's investigation was interrupted in December 1962 when heavy winter snows made the cabin inaccessible. However, his journal indicates that he spent the winter months attempting to research the Ashford family through official records and local historical sources. This research yielded surprisingly little information. The family appeared to have left virtually no trace in official records. No property deeds, tax records, marriage licenses, or death certificates could be found in any of the county courthouses throughout the Arkansas Ozark region. The only reference Whitmore could locate was a brief mention in a 1924 edition of the Mountain Home newspaper, which noted that several new families had settled in the remote areas north of Yellville, but provided no names or specific details. Local residents he interviewed claimed no knowledge of any family named Ashford, though several mentioned hearing stories over the years about odd folks who lived deep in the woods and were said to keep to themselves in ways that weren't natural. When spring made the cabin accessible again, Whitmore returned to continue his investigation, only to make a discovery that fundamentally changed his understanding of what he had found. While removing several letters from the wall for closer examination, he discovered that many of them had been written on paper that had previously contained other text. Closer inspection revealed that what he had initially taken for simple personal correspondence had actually been written over existing letters, with the original text carefully scratched out or covered over. Using techniques he had learned during his military service in the Signal Corps, Whitmore was able to recover fragments of these underlying texts. What emerged was a pattern that suggested the letters he had been reading were not genuine correspondence at all, but rather careful forgeries created to hide the original content. The authentic letters underneath, where they could be recovered, told a completely different story. These recovered fragments revealed that the cabin had served as a way station for travelers moving through the remote Ozark region during the 1920s and 1930s. The original letters were routine communications between family members, separated by travel, requests for assistance from stranded travelers, and reports of arrivals and departures. They painted a picture of a family that, while isolated, had served as an unofficial stopping point for those crossing the difficult mountain terrain. However, something had clearly changed sometime in the early 1930s. The last authentic letters, dating from 1933, contained increasingly urgent requests for help from family members who had apparently encountered some form of danger. These letters referenced strangers who won't leave and people who ask too many questions about who comes and goes. The final authentic letter, dated November 17, 1933, was written in a shaking hand and contained only the words, "They know about the others now." burn everything. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the letters covering the walls were forgeries created to conceal the original correspondence, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a false narrative about the Ashford family's activities. The question remained, who had created these forgeries and why? Whitmore's journal entries from this period reveal a man increasingly consumed by the mystery he had uncovered. He began spending entire days at the cabin, methodically removing and examining every piece of correspondence. His handwriting, usually precise and controlled, became increasingly erratic as his investigation progressed. He began to note details about the cabin itself that he had initially overlooked: scratches on the interior walls that might have been made by fingernails, stains on the wooden floor that resisted all attempts at identification, and areas where the logs showed signs of having been recently replaced, despite the structure's apparent age. The more Whitmore investigated, the more convinced he became that the cabin had been the site of activities far more sinister than any family correspondence could reveal. His journal contains detailed sketches of the interior layout, with particular attention to what he determined had once been a root cellar beneath the main floor. This cellar, accessed through a concealed trapdoor, contained evidence that it had been modified from its original purpose in ways that Whitmore found deeply disturbing. The cellar walls had been lined with additional logs, creating a double wall construction that would have effectively soundproofed the space. The floor had been covered with what appeared to be zinc sheeting, suggesting preparations for activities that might require easy cleaning. Most disturbing of all, iron rings had been embedded in the walls at regular intervals, clearly designed to secure restraints of some kind. In his journal entry dated May 23, 1963, Whitmore wrote, "I can no longer deny what this place was used for. The evidence is overwhelming, despite every attempt that has been made to conceal it. The letters were meant to create a false history to hide the true purpose of this place. But the physical evidence cannot be explained away. This cabin was used as a prison, and whatever happened to the people who were brought here, they did not leave alive." Whitmore's investigation might have continued indefinitely, but it was brought to an abrupt end by the intervention of local authorities. In June 1963, the Marion County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous report of suspicious activity in the remote area where the cabin was located. Deputies investigating the report found Whitmore at the site and questioned him about his activities there. The official police report, filed June 15, 1963, described Whitmore as agitated and uncooperative, claiming he was conducting research into historical crimes that had taken place at the location. However, when pressed for details, he was unable to provide any concrete evidence of criminal activity beyond his interpretation of the correspondence he had found. The deputies noted that Whitmore appeared to have been living at the site for extended periods and expressed concern about his mental state. Following this encounter with law enforcement, Whitmore abruptly ended his investigation. His journal entries from this period suggest he had been warned to discontinue his activities at the cabin, though the source of this warning is not specified. His final entry regarding the cabin, dated June 20, 1963, reads simply, "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some knowledge carries a price that is too high to pay. I understand now why the letters were written as they were. The truth was never meant to be discovered." The cabin itself was destroyed by what was officially reported as a lightning strike in August 1963, though several local residents questioned whether such a precise strike could have occurred during a summer when thunderstorms had been unusually rare. The fire burned with such intensity that virtually nothing remained except the stone foundation and a few pieces of twisted metal. Any evidence that might have definitively proven or disproven Whitmore's theories was reduced to ash. Whitmore returned to his regular duties with the Highway Department, but colleagues noted a significant change in his behavior following his experience with the cabin. Previously known as a gregarious and outgoing man who enjoyed socializing with his co-workers, he became withdrawn and secretive. He began requesting assignments that kept him away from remote areas, particularly in the Ozark region, claiming that such locations were unsuitable for survey work for reasons he would not specify. His work performance, previously exemplary, began to deteriorate noticeably. Supervisors reported that his survey measurements had become unreliable and that he seemed unable to concentrate on routine tasks. Several times he was found at his worksite, appearing to listen intently to sounds that no one else could hear. When questioned about this behavior, he would claim to have heard voices calling for help from deep in the woods. The decline in Whitmore's mental and physical health accelerated throughout 1964 and 1965. He began taking increasingly frequent sick leave, claiming to suffer from persistent nightmares that prevented him from sleeping. Medical examinations revealed no physical cause for his symptoms, but physicians noted significant weight loss and signs of chronic stress. His few remaining friends reported that he spoke obsessively about completing the investigation and finding the others who were taken, but he refused to provide any clear explanation of what he meant by these statements. In early 1966, Whitmore submitted a formal request to the Arkansas Department of Highways asking to be transferred to duties that would keep him exclusively in urban areas. His request was accompanied by a letter that his supervisor later described as rambling and incoherent, in which he claimed to have discovered evidence of organized activities in remote areas that posed a danger to anyone working alone in such locations. The transfer was granted more out of concern for Whitmore's mental state than because of any credibility given to his claims. However, the transfer did not appear to provide the relief Whitmore had hoped for. Colleagues in his new urban assignment reported that he continued to display signs of severe anxiety and paranoia. He became convinced that he was being watched and followed, frequently checking the locks on his office door and refusing to work late hours when the building was largely empty. Several times, he was found examining letters and documents delivered to his office with what appeared to be excessive suspicion, as if he expected to find hidden messages or threats. The end came suddenly in March 1967. Whitmore was found dead in his apartment by his landlord, who had been concerned by the smell of decomposition coming from the unit. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the medical examiner noted that the body showed signs of severe malnutrition despite the fact that Whitmore's financial situation should have allowed for adequate food. The apartment was found to be in a state of extreme disarray, with papers and documents scattered throughout every room. Among these papers, investigators found what appeared to be Whitmore's attempts to recreate the letters he had found in the cabin. He had filled dozens of notebooks with handwritten copies of the correspondence, along with his own attempts to decode what he believed were hidden messages within the text. Some pages contained the same letter copied multiple times, with slight variations, as if he were trying to determine the correct version through repetition. Most disturbing of all, investigators found that Whitmore had begun writing letters of his own in the same style as those he had found in the cabin. These letters, apparently never sent, were addressed to people with names that appeared nowhere else in his records. The content of these letters suggested that Whitmore believed he had somehow become part of the same network of correspondence that he had discovered at the cabin. He wrote about maintaining the necessary silence and protecting the work from interference, using language almost identical to that found in the Ashford family letters. The investigation into Whitmore's death was brief and perfunctory. The large quantity of what appeared to be research materials in his apartment was noted, but not examined in detail. The official report concluded that he had suffered a psychological breakdown related to work-related stress, and that his death was the result of neglect of his physical health during this breakdown. The papers found in his apartment were boxed and stored in the basement of the Marion County Courthouse, where they remained for several years. The story might have ended there, forgotten like so many other tales of individuals who had lost themselves in the isolation and mystery of the Ozark wilderness. However, in 1968, Professor Ambrose Hartwell of the University of Arkansas Anthropology Department encountered a reference to Whitmore's discovery while researching early settlement patterns in remote Arkansas communities. Hartwell, a specialist in frontier social structures, was intrigued by what seemed to be documentary evidence of an unknown isolated community. Hartwell's initial research into the case was conducted through official channels, examining Whitmore's Highway Department records and the police reports related to his death. Like Whitmore before him, Hartwell found virtually no official documentation related to the Ashford family or their activities in the Ozark region. However, his academic connections allowed him access to resources that had been unavailable to the surveyor. Through contacts at various universities throughout the region, Hartwell was able to locate several other researchers who had encountered similar mysteries in their work. Dr. Margaret Holloway at the University of Missouri had documented several cases of isolated communities that had apparently vanished without leaving any trace in official records. Professor James Whitfield at Arkansas State University had collected oral histories from elderly residents throughout the Ozark region, many of which contained references to families who lived different and places in the woods where people went but didn't come back. What emerged from this collaborative research was a pattern suggesting that the Ashford family was not unique, but rather part of a network of isolated communities throughout the Ozark region that had operated outside normal social and legal boundaries during the early to mid-20th century. These communities appeared to have maintained contact with each other through systems of correspondence and possibly shared resources and information. Hartwell's research also uncovered evidence that law enforcement and local government officials had been aware of some of these communities but had chosen to ignore their activities as long as they remained isolated and did not interfere with more settled areas. Several retired sheriffs, when interviewed confidentially, admitted to having received reports over the years about strange doings in remote areas, but stated that the difficulty of accessing such locations and the lack of specific complaints from identifiable victims had made investigation impractical. One particularly revealing interview was conducted with retired Marion County Sheriff Edgar Bellwether, who had served in that position from 1935 to 1962. Bellwether, interviewed at his home in 1969, just months before his death, admitted that his department had been aware of several isolated families or communities in the remote Ozark areas, but had maintained an unofficial policy of letting sleeping dogs lie as long as no crimes were reported by outside parties. According to Bellwether, his department had occasionally received reports from travelers or hunters who claimed to have encountered unfriendly locals in remote areas, or who reported finding abandoned cabins that showed signs of recent habitation, but whose occupants could not be located. However, when deputies investigated such reports, they typically found nothing that could be characterized as definitive evidence of criminal activity. Bellwether's most startling revelation was his admission that his department had, on at least 3 occasions, discovered human remains in remote areas that could not be readily explained. These discoveries had been handled quietly, with the remains being buried in unmarked graves after perfunctory investigations failed to identify the victims or determine the cause of death. The locations of these burials had not been recorded, and no public reports had been filed. When pressed for details about these discoveries, Bellwether became visibly uncomfortable and refused to provide specifics. However, he did reveal that all 3 discoveries had shared certain characteristics. The remains had been found in areas known to be associated with isolated communities. They showed signs of having been deliberately concealed. And in each case, personal effects found with the remains suggested the victims had been travelers or temporary residents rather than local people. Hartwell's research was interrupted in late 1969 when he suffered what was officially described as a nervous breakdown. Colleagues reported that he had become increasingly obsessed with his research into the Ozark communities, spending long hours studying the correspondence found in Whitmore's apartment and attempting to establish connections between various unexplained disappearances throughout the region. His behavior had become erratic, and he had begun making statements suggesting he believed the communities might still be active. The professor's final research notes, found in his office after he was hospitalized, contained detailed maps of the Ozark region with numerous locations marked as potential sites. He had apparently been planning an extensive field investigation to verify the existence of these communities. However, his notes also revealed a growing paranoia that his research was being monitored by unknown parties who were attempting to prevent him from completing his work. Hartwell spent 6 months in psychiatric care before returning to university duties in 1970. However, his research interests had shifted dramatically, and he never again investigated topics related to isolated communities or unexplained disappearances. When questioned about his previous research, he would only state that he had concluded that some subjects are better left unexplored, and that certain knowledge serves no beneficial purpose. The materials related to Whitmore's discovery and Hartwell's subsequent research were quietly archived in the university library's special collections, where they remain largely inaccessible to casual researchers. The official explanation for this restriction is that the materials contain unverified allegations that could be damaging to living persons or their families. However, some researchers have suggested that the real reason for the restriction is to prevent the kind of obsessive investigation that appeared to have damaged both Whitmore and Hartwell. In the decades since these events, the story of the letters found in the Ozark cabin has occasionally surfaced in local folklore and amateur paranormal investigations. However, the lack of concrete evidence and the absence of any surviving physical materials has relegated the story to the status of regional legend. Most residents of the Ozark region, when asked about such stories, will acknowledge having heard various versions, but will typically dismiss them as the product of overactive imaginations and the natural human tendency to find mystery in the isolation and wilderness of the region. Yet certain facts remain difficult to explain away completely. The official records do confirm the existence of both Cornelius Whitmore and Professor Ambrose Hartwell, and document their unusual behavior and eventual breakdown in connection with their research. The police reports and Highway Department files, while providing little detail, do confirm that something was discovered in the remote cabin that was considered significant enough to warrant official attention. Perhaps more tellingly, several researchers who have attempted to follow up on the story have reported experiencing unusual difficulties in their investigations. Documents that should be readily available in public archives have been found to be missing or misfiled. Local residents who initially seem willing to discuss family histories or local legends become reluctant to continue such conversations when the topics turn to specific incidents or families. Even amateur investigators report feeling an unusual sense of unease when exploring remote areas of the Ozark region, particularly those that show signs of previous human habitation. The location where the cabin once stood remains marked only by the stone foundation that survived the fire. Hikers who encounter this site occasionally report a persistent sense of being watched, even when they are clearly alone. Some have noted an unusual silence in the immediate area, as if wildlife instinctively avoids the location. Metal detector enthusiasts who have searched the site have reported finding numerous small metal objects buried in the ground around the foundation, but these objects typically prove to be too corroded for identification. In 1985, the Arkansas Historical Society commissioned a survey of abandoned structures throughout the Ozark region as part of a broader project documenting early settlement patterns. The survey team, while finding numerous abandoned cabins and homesteads, reported several sites where foundations and other structural remains suggested the former existence of buildings that could not be accounted for in any official records. These sites were typically located in areas so remote that accessing them required considerable effort and specialized equipment. What made these unexplained sites particularly noteworthy was their common characteristics. All were positioned to provide maximum concealment from casual observation. All showed evidence of construction techniques that suggested considerable skill and planning, and all had been abandoned in ways that suggested deliberate destruction rather than simple neglect. Most puzzling of all, several sites showed evidence of modifications that served no apparent practical purpose. Additional walls built within existing structures, underground chambers that extended far beyond normal root cellars, and systems of drainage that seemed designed to handle far more water than any normal domestic use would require. The survey team's final report recommended further investigation of these sites, but this recommendation was never acted upon. The project director, Dr. Sandra Moss, later stated that funding for such investigations had been withdrawn without explanation, and that subsequent attempts to secure alternative funding had been unsuccessful. Dr. Moss also revealed that several members of the survey team had expressed reluctance to continue working on the project, claiming that the remote sites had made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. Today, the story of the letters found in the forgotten Ozark cabin exists primarily in the realm of local legend and internet speculation. The lack of surviving physical evidence makes verification impossible, and the official tendency to dismiss such stories as folklore ensures that serious investigation remains unlikely. Yet those familiar with the case continue to point to certain troubling questions that remain unanswered. If Whitmore's discovery was simply the product of an overwrought imagination, why did his investigation attract official attention and interference? If the correspondence he found was meaningless, why did multiple researchers who attempted to study it subsequently suffer psychological breakdowns? If the isolated communities described in the research were purely fictional, why do official records contain unexplained gaps and missing documents in precisely the areas where such communities were said to exist? Perhaps most disturbing of all, why do people who attempt to investigate these questions continue to report experiencing the same sense of being watched and monitored that troubled both Whitmore and Hartwell? Several recent researchers have reported finding their homes and offices searched, their computers accessed without authorization, and their personal communications monitored. These incidents are typically dismissed by authorities as either paranoid delusions or common criminal activities with no connection to the researchers' work. Yet the pattern persists with remarkable consistency. Those who seek to uncover the truth about what happened in the remote Ozark wilderness during the mid-20th century find themselves facing obstacles that seem designed not just to prevent discovery, but to discourage further investigation. It is as if some force, whether official or unofficial, remains committed to ensuring that certain secrets remain buried in the depths of the Ozark forests. The cabin where Cornelius Whitmore made his disturbing discovery is gone, reduced to ash and scattered stones. The letters that lined its walls with their tales of systematic horrors disguised as family correspondence exist now only in copies and transcriptions that themselves may be incomplete or inaccurate. The people who might have provided testimony about the events they described have long since vanished into the anonymity of death and time. But somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Ozark Mountains, Other foundations remain, other secrets lie buried beneath decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. The silence that protected those isolated communities for so many years continues to shield their legacy from discovery. And perhaps, as some would argue, this is as it should be. Perhaps some truths are too dark to be brought into the light, some knowledge too dangerous to be possessed by those unprepared for its implications. The letters discovered in that forgotten cabin told a story of human monsters who hid their true nature behind facades of normalcy and family affection. They revealed how isolation and secrecy could allow the worst of human nature to flourish unchecked, how geographic remoteness could become a shield for activities too horrific to be comprehended by civilized society. Most chilling of all, they suggested that such activities were not the aberration of a single family, but part of a larger network of like-minded individuals who had found ways to pursue their darkest impulses while remaining hidden from justice. Whether that network still exists, whether other cabins still stand in remote corners of the Ozark wilderness, with their walls lined with similar correspondence, whether new letters are still being written by those who learned from the example of the Ashford family, these questions remain unanswered. The silence of the mountains guards its secrets well, and those who have tried too hard to break that silence have learned that some prices are too high to pay for knowledge. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story is not what was found in that forgotten cabin, but what remains unfound in the thousands of other hidden places throughout the Ozark wilderness. For if the correspondence discovered by Cornelius Whitmore represented only a single family's activities over a few decades, what other horrors might be revealed if every concealed cabin, every isolated foundation, every forgotten corner of those ancient mountains could be thoroughly investigated? The mountains keep their silence, and perhaps it is better that they do. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some letters should never be read. Some truths are too terrible to bear, too dangerous to know. In the depths of the Ozark wilderness, the wind still whispers through the trees, and sometimes those who listen carefully claim they can hear echoes of voices long silenced, calling out from places that time and nature have tried their best to forget. The legacy of those macabre letters continues to haunt not just the remote corners of Arkansas, but the minds of all who have encountered their dark revelations. They serve as a reminder that evil can flourish in isolation, that human nature contains depths of depravity that civilization struggles to acknowledge, and that sometimes the most horrific truths are hidden not in plain sight, but in the silent spaces between the known and the forgotten, in the empty places where no one thinks to look, and where no one wants to find what might be there waiting to be discovered.